Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to express my warm thoughts to Professor Si Mohamed Nimish, who is really the driving force behind the WCCS. He has worked arduously up to now to prepare this conference, but unfortunately he can't be there because of a last-minute emergency. I thank him for the raw quality of his work. I would like also to thank my colleague Nicolas Piriguiou for his responsible management of the budget and for overseeing the logistics of this conference. I also thank the communication team and the Multimedia Center of Africa Business School, and in particular my esteemed colleagues Shada Al-Haj, Souad Al-Khail, Samir Fariani, Rashid Iba, Imad Uzrar, and Ilyas Bessal for the fantastic work they have achieved. They will be supporting us through the conference, and it has been a pleasure to work with them, all of them. In my talk, I would like to examine the way complexity manifests itself and is experienced by ordinary citizens across the globe as a means of proposing an alternative to today's dominant populisms. After 5 decades of development in biochemistry, physics, and mathematics, the sciences of complexity are well established in academia. I personally hope that a new, future-oriented school of thought could distinguish complexity more precisely than its mathematization. As the Indian philosopher Muhammad Iqbal envisions, an act is temporal or profound if it is done in a spirit of detachment from the infinite complexity of life behind it. It is spiritual if it is inspired by that complexity. In late modernity, we have lost this performative sense of complexity-inspired action. What we have instead generated today is an invasive and explosive complexity emerging from our artifacts. Nothing modeled, simulated, and run in vitro or in silico compares to what is currently observed in the first quarter of the 21st century on many geopolitical, ecological, technological, economic, social fronts. For starters, a quick reminder of how complexity in the real world can sometimes take revenge on us. September 11 attacks of the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, the 2008 financial collapse unleashed by the US subprime crisis, the Fukushima nuclear incident created by a tsunami, the 2010s world social movements launched by the Arab Spring, the 2020 COVID pandemics and world confinement. We have also to consider the complication of catastrophic magnitude resulting from simplistic and deterministic reactions to complex problems in international affairs. The war in Ukraine, the live-streamed genocidal massacre in Gaza, the carpet bombing of Iran's nuclear installations, the first world power inexorably becoming the sick man of the West. We are lost in a host of complexity, in real time and space, adrift in a sea of systems with constant shocks from reality. We are lost in complexity due to the multitude of our intricacies between the great acceleration in gross production of materials, goods, and artifacts, and the great recession in terms of economic and political governance. According to the French archaeologist and paleontologist Leroy-Gourand, the hominization or anthropogenesis, that is the evolutionary process of becoming human, co-evolved with the development of tools and techniques. If the hammer represents the external cognitive function of the fist and the spoon, the palm of the hand, what does an instrument like the mobile phone extent in terms of biological functions. The smartphone epitomizes the advent of the digital revolution and ubiquitous communication that have today taken precedence over any other human activity, and it is transforming the way we operate as a species. The man-machine interface has now reached the phase of a trans or post-human condition. Is this process still the pursuit of hominization as envisioned by Leroi-Gourhan, involving the liberation of the hand, the mouth, the brain, and the extension of the nervous system? Certainly. This odyssey of scientific and technological advancement is sufficiently exposed and well promoted. It is an essential episode of our grand narrative on progress, liberal, and prosperous society. There is no need to emphasize the sanitized history of Western modernity and the tremendous progress achieved over the last 75 years of the Great Acceleration, which some refer to as the Anthropocene. Following two world wars that killed 80 to 100 million people, the Great Acceleration has been pursued as an exponential rate to the detriment of the natural environment that is now affected by the scale of our artifacts. To put it differently, the complexity found in nature, humans, and animals has been absorbed and partially destroyed by the complexity of man-made artifacts. The planet manifests countless signs of saturation of time and space due to the toxicity of this artifactual world that continues to grow and expand to the point of disrupting the climate. Humanity has become a geophysical force that deregulates the biosphere, and now, in return, global warming and increased natural catastrophes impose constraints on our species. We are still locked in the pursuit of goals and objectives that are deterministic, reductionist, and linear in a world that is increasingly nonlinear, more complex, and interdependent. This situation leads to the multiplication of wicked problems and the cumulative challenge of complexities and also of complications resulting from our inability to interpret them. If humanity is locked into a destructive trajectory, devastating its habitat on Earth, it is due to a collective belief in the omnipotence of the market and free trade, which is grounded in religious belief. Economics and politics are two academic disciplines that are not anything but exact sciences. Dominant paradigms of economics, for example, may have a scientific surface layer, but beneath we may easily dig up an underlayer made of radioactive theo-mythologies. The laissez-faire of the market relies on a bottom-up effect of self-regulation, where individuals, while pursuing their self-interest, produce global health. This axiom can be traced from the famous quotation of Adam Smith, the father of economics, when he describes the investor or the merchant who neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was not part of his intention. The invisible hand has been discussed, interpreted, and reinterpreted several generations after Adam Smith's lifetime. Today, we interpret the invisible hand as an expression of emergence and self-organization, but that was not Adam Smith's intent. But the false premise of the invisible hand parable is that the main local action intended is and remains only the satisfaction of self-interest, and that its pursuit may produce something unintended and necessarily productive and good at a collective level. This has nothing to do with applied nonlinear science, but is essentially the reflection of an inverted or perverted theology underlayer. And Adam Smith found it directly in Bernard Mandeville's book, The Fable of the Bees, or private vices, public benefits. Mandeville, a Calvinist and a physician of souls, formulates a simple but deeply subversive idea for Western metaphysics. Lux et tenebris, light from darkness, good arises from evil. Private vices produce public virtue. Judged immoral and even satanic, his fable of the bees was publicly burned throughout Europe during his lifetime in the 18th century. His works that included a modest defense of public stews or an essay upon whoring exerted a lasting influence on economic thought, particularly among the founding members of the Mont Pelerin Society, created in 1947 and including 8 Nobel laureates in economics, whose ideas on tax cuts, deregulation, limited government, and privatization constitute the mainstream economic thinking of the past 50 years. So, from Adam Smith to Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, proponents of spontaneous order and deregulation, all ultimately drew upon Mandeville, who during his lifetime was nicknamed Man Devil. The classical economic rationale also promotes another decisive magical thinking, which consists in a top-down growth model where wealth is supposed to trickle down. This idea is sold by elites as a pure mechanism of downward causation. The reality test shows that it's also another totally misleading fable when we look at the reality of wealth distribution. This has been tested on many countries and periods since the 1980s, and the distribution of wealth has never met the ideological claim. A recent UNDP Global Human Development Report notes that a generalized increase in inequalities everywhere in the world. A recent Oxfam report notes that Africa's 4 richest billionaires concentrate more financial resources than half of its population. The World Inequality Report of this year unveils that, I quote, the wealthiest 0.001% alone, fewer than 60,000 multimillionaires, control today 3 times more wealth than half of humanity combined. And according to the World Bank, half of the world's population lives on less than $6.85 per day. Is there today a more massive, devastating violence than these inequalities? Inequality cannot be explained and justified by its nonlinear and asymmetric expression. When we identify these patterns experimentally, we observe that asymmetry and nonlinearity generally profit and empower the weakest and tiniest, not the stronger or the richer. Hubris in wealth, economic and political power is a counter-nature accumulation and concentration of theological, mythological order. It is mainly responsible of the global wicked problems. In a planetary context marked by inequality, it is therefore not surprising to observe, once again, the transversality of protest movements. Thus, in September 2025, almost within the same week, Gen Z demonstrations took place in Nepal, Peru, Madagascar, and Morocco. Wicked problems are questions that are intractable, recalcitrant, and that resist all the solutions that attempt to resolve them. In Morocco, but also in other African countries, notably in the Sahel, the social question is at the origin of wicked problems. They undermine infrastructures and abruptly declare themselves, often at a bifurcation or a critical threshold. Whenever the social question reaches a critical point, it becomes a globalized, quintessential political issue. An initial spark inflames minds around tragic and symbolic death, such as that of the street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia in 2011, or the fish seller Mohsen Fikri in Al Hoceima in 2016 or of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. From a triggering event, these social movements rapidly multiply and diversify. Movements of the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street in London, Maple String in Canada, Indignados of Spain, Taksim in Istanbul, Hirak in the Maghreb and in Lebanon, and lately the Gen Z movement in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Nepal, Peru, Madagascar, and Morocco. It is not possible to resolve the wicked problem associated with social issues and citizenship with hammer blows or heavy prison sentences. These problems are by nature irreducible. Economistic, political science, technocratic, and security approaches are ultimately doomed to failure. However, the science of government, the very first definition of cybernetics in 1834, states a law of requisite variety, which affirms that the more complex the problems are, the more sophisticated their solutions must be. This law postulates that only a regulatory system endowed with a complexity that absorbs complexity can cope with these problems, typically insoluble through the science of control and manipulation. Yet, the tragic dimension of the era we live in is that today's leaders and decision makers are at the opposite extreme of this way of managing world affairs. Governance, whether national or global, remains conservative and conform to the so-called law of the hammer, formulated in 1966 by the American psychologist Abraham Maslow, which conceives all problems to be treated as nails to hammer on. Here we are at this precise moment of history of maximal man-made artifactual complexity and maximal psychological anachronism. The tendency to privilege a single standard method, a single tool, that is the hammer of brute force, to resolve arduous and varied problems is a form of cognitive bias still prevailing in the 21st century. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, it has become evident that we are engaged in a planetary process of brutalization. We thought we were living in an unprecedented era, yet we observe the return of relics or relicas of historical cycles from which emerged megalomaniac leaders, extreme right political formations, populist authoritarianism, surveillance of individuals, and media propaganda. The recourse to identity, to nationality in favor of supremacist designs aims to mobilize collective emotions in an age of sad passions of crowds. This diverts attention from the structural causes of the current polycrisis and of wicked problems. One of the principal reasons of the current brutalization is to legitimize the exponential increase of economic and social inequalities. This justification of inequality takes up managerial formulas in vogue such as adapt or perish, change or die, evolve or extinguish, innovate or evaporate, to euphemistically account for an economic and financial violence at work on a planetary scale. The widening of inequalities appears from a perspective in which the poorest and most discriminated people are accused of generating undue social expenditures. It is against this inversion of meaning that social movements have mobilized over the last 15 years. In the United States, Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize in Economics and former chief economist of the World Bank, denounces the fact that the government has engaged in an administrative paralysis shutdown of the federal state when it served first and foremost to legitimize predatory forms of political economy as well as the interest of oligarchs. This term of oligarch is now commonly used in the current vocabulary of 21st century economics. This has been carried in a few months, effectively cutting with the chainsaw, a variant of the law of the hammer, into public expenditures to dismiss by tens of thousands of employees of social, educational, medical sector, to deport migrants by thousands, and to cut the budget of the most important university, ranging from teaching to research. Such is the policy of brutalization that is given to see, a policy of relentlessness against social, educational, and health issues. The intention is clear. The greatest fortunes in the world at the head of platform states that are big tech finance and support this brutalization, provided it exempts them from antitrust control, from protection of individuals' private sphere, from appropriation and exploitation of big data outside any fiscal taxation. The ever greater enrichment of an ever smaller number of individuals from whom almost nothing can trickle down consolidates the non-renewal of the elites. On the decline of elites and the current revival of authoritarian liberalism, a relevant perspective has been developed by Johann Chapoutot, a French historian of Nazism, who showed how a century ago a democratic regime paved the way for the extreme right, focusing on what seemed the worst enemy, Bolshevik communism. It is the elites who preceded Nazism that are to blame for their irresponsibility. This historian does not hesitate to analyze the current rise to power now and almost everywhere of political leaders who are simplistic and yet no less predatory. It would be an error to exonerate their predecessors in power and the defective role of elites who facilitate their entrism by focusing on migration, Islamic radicalism, and terrorism as the most dangerous and worst threats of our times. Professor Peter Turchin, who will present a talk just after mine, is a specialist in complexity studies who proposes an explanatory hypothesis of elite overproduction, which would be the source of political instability. According to his approach, when elites are too numerous and cannot access the sphere of power and influence, their circulation and renewal are not ensured. But tech and digital companies owe their colossal growth and capital accumulation in large part to the fact that they are very little or not taxed, and that fiscal law remains stammering regarding them while it falls inexorably everywhere upon middle classes of the planet, both pressuring and making them precarious. The case of the firm Apple is revealing of tax advantage practices judged illegal, from which it benefited in Ireland since 1991, with a rate of taxation on its European profits that never exceeded 1% annually, and that was 0.005% in 2014. One better understands from then how big tech firms, including the GAFAM, find themselves among companies whose stock market capitalization exceeds $1 trillion, exploiting for a quarter of a century big data whose economic value is colossal, which still has no fiscal recognition. It is not creative destruction, but surveillance capitalism and the absence of law for digital value creation that would explain this boom and the evasion of resources that don't go primarily to prevention and treatment of wicked problems. Never has the term leadership been invoked so often, and yet it has never been so absent from the way world affairs are being conducted. Where is leadership in the face of the climate emergency, in the face of economic protectionism and trade wars, current wars and tensions involving 5 nuclear powers, Russia, Israel, USA, Pakistan, India, the failure of global governance, and the muzzling or paralysis of international institutions? Since the COVID-19 pandemic and the planetary lockdown that followed, degenerated or unleashed forms of leadership have suddenly gained the upper hand. The current vogue for populist and authoritarian leaders, for entrepreneurs of salvation, and for digital platform influencers is flooding the public stage and dragging debates down into the gutter. It consists of a political reality television where a leader endowed with a vocabulary not exceeding 500 words align at intention and attention on symptoms and accessory facts, thus stifling the citizens' attention and critical sense through diversion and distraction. At the end of my talk, it seems obvious that a brief review of international affairs reveals that we are completely lost among these different combined forms of complexity and complication. Thinking about the future requires looking at the complexity approach as a means and not as an end. Albert Einstein, conceptor of the general theory of relativity, once said that the problems that exist in this world cannot be solved by the level of thinking that created them. We need then a new theory, a new vision beyond complexity to apprehend the future. Complexity is not about the future, but about its prehistory. My colleagues insisted that I give a tonality of optimism to my talk, so I would declare with the poet Kenneth White that I'm neither a pessimist nor an optimist, but a possibilist. My motto in life is that I believe in man and in the future. أؤمن بالإنسان وبالمستقبل. I have written a book, the results of 10 years of work, to conceive a possibilist philosophy of the future that I called Iqbal. The meaning of this word conveys all kinds of openings that express a dynamic reflections oriented toward otherness, the welcoming of opposite, and toward encounters with the unknown and the contingent. As a sociologist, I assumed today a positional viewpoint. I have privileged viewing the world through the eyes of the people who put skin in the game, standing on an isthmus, a barzakh in Arabic, between the collapse of an outdated planetary system and the birth of a new post-Western one. So welcome to this conference to all of you who scrutinize signs, signals, and seeds of hope for a new world to come. Thank you very much.